Morning, everyone. Am I audible?
Yes, sir, you are visible and audible.
Thank
Morning,
you very
sir.
much. Because
Good
you see,
morning,
I am
sir.
not so savvy with this technicalities, so I am not very sure. I always want to be sure that whatever is expected of me to say and what I say is going across. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Uh, as she has announced, I'm going to speak about plurality, literary discourse, and translation, poetics, and politics. But before I do so, I really want to congratulate the organizers of this Rajasthan Association for Studies in English organizers for choosing a theme like this. The theme being plurality in unity, which is, as Dr. Chindalia also said, is so very appropriate to our times when the world, through various strategies, particularly during the last few years, and also taking advantage of the calamity that has befallen the humanity, namely the pandemic, the world is being pushed into a kind of unitariness on all fronts: economic, political, cultural, and they deserve more congratulations for trying to link it up with the literary discourse that abounds around us, and also the discourse of translating literary texts. You see, as I said a minute ago, there has been a real threat to plurality, particularly during the last few years. You look at the tom-tommed America First concept. You look at the recent pronouncements to make Hindi the first language of this country, to look at some of the challenges to cultural practices. For instance, the Islamic cultural concept of hijab in Europe or Sikh turbans in Canada, the attempts by China to subsume the Tibetan culture, to subsume Sikhism, Jainism, Buddhism under the larger pantheon of Hinduism. These are all attempts to kind of push us into unitariness. Not only that, during the last few decades, shall I say, the onslaught by Wahhabism to try and suppress the diversity within Islam, or to push with an aggression Roman Catholic denomination of Christianity, or a particular brand of Hindutva in various parts of the world, are all attempts to try and suppress, if not completely do away with this plurality. I also congratulate the organizers for linking it up with literary discourse, as I said, or the discourse of translation, because that, together with other attacks on society in general, are under a big threat. Take, for example, something that has been bandied about very recently in the name of hurting the community sentiments, particularly through literary writings, through journalistic writings, or even oral pronouncements. Anything and everything that you do not like, you just try and say it hurts the sentiments, and then you go to town indulging in violence. It is very heartening to know that only a couple of days ago, one of the high courts has chastised people and refused to accept this concept of hurting the sentiments. They have preferred individual right to state, to say whatever they want to say, over this kind of chauvinistic observation. Therefore, it is very, very timely that this conference is holding its annual conference on this theme. Let me say this, that while thanking them, I will call my remarks as inaugural remarks rather than an inaugural or keynote address, because these are going to be very brief. My brief presentation, as I said, has three parts. In the first part, I will discuss the beginning and development of plurality in human society. In the second one, I'll talk about plurality in literary discourse. And finally, in the third one, I will elaborate on the issues relating to translating literary discourse. Let me begin by observing that plurality in human societies, and since the 19th century in modern nation states, is as old as the very inception of human societies. Let me give you an idea as to why I make that observation. The biological binary, which has now transmuted itself into societal gender multiplicity. We now talk of the third gender and the fourth gender. You know, all this is how pluralism began among groups of ancient humans and later communities of humans as they emerged and evolved. So what I'm trying to say is that plurality is, in a way, built into the very genetic code of humans. Later on, as these groups converted themselves into communities and particularly interacted with nature and natural phenomenon, and then for various reasons, they mutated themselves, and they migrated to various parts. They dispersed to various parts of the world. I'm sure you are familiar with this fact, with this hypothesis that all humanity originated in parts of Africa millions of years ago, particularly eastern parts of Africa, from where they, because of various reasons, which could be environmental, which could be cultural, which could be interpersonal, they kind of dispersed to various parts of the world. And therefore, with this happening, plurality became more complex. It became more complex because new ethnicities came about. It became more complex because variations occurred among groups and communities due to regional differences, due to environmental differences, due to language differences, and due to cultural practices. Let me try and remind myself and all of us here that the differences that we have today in terms of ethnicity, that is talking of the whites and the black people, have the same origin. And that is what we call unity in plurality. And similarly, today at loggerheads, the Muslims and the Semitics, the Jews, they belong to the same culture initially. We all know the Semitic culture and the Semitic languages. So while this map of plurality became more and more complex, communities had to devise various strategies to govern themselves. And for the sake of governance, further division came about. Groups were divided into subgroups and subgroups. In the name of caste, for instance, in India, in the name of various religions, and in the terms of locations, yes. Let's not forget that we talk in terms of higher and lower castes, Christians and pagans, hill people and people from the plains. Interestingly, all this was done in the name of what we call The argument is still given when further divisions are created in the plurality. The arguments are given in the name of efficient or more efficient administration, so that people's welfare can be looked at or are administered more effectively. Well, strange. In any case, these divisions and subdivisions also performed a very interesting function, and that is it deepened the plurality, the human plurality. It deepened it further. As a result of it, this deepening at various levels, at various places, and in various manners in course of time. And friends, I want to remind ourselves, when we use that phrase in course of time in this particular context, we are talking of millennia. We are talking of, I don't know, millions of years. Every time a new skull is thrown up in East Africa, you know, we and our ancient antiquity becomes, takes back a few more million years, takes us back a few more million years. So in course of time, as I said, groups came about, subgroups came about, and subgroups came about, and each one of them acquired certain unique features, real or imaginary, through which they wanted to, and they did demarcate themselves. Call them, if you like, cultural traits, but more significantly, these unique features became the identity markers of various communities and groups and subgroups. And this is what we have today by way of plurality. These cultural traits would be manner of dressing. An excellent example can be the headgear. You know, the way you wear your headgear in Rajasthan is very different from the way you wear headgear among the Sikhs. In Africa, women's headgear in various countries and regions presents a wonderful, colorful galaxy of how they wear their headgear. So manner of dressing could be one such unique trait. Food habits is another. Forms of address and one another. In Punjab, somewhere we may say Pitaji, Bapu. In Punjab, in colloquial language, we say Buddha. Main Buddha nu aakya. You know, these are manners of address which also distinguish communities from one another. And most of these were given by the societies. These were not natural to the people. And therefore, there are two kinds of identity markers which deepen our plurality. One is what is given by nature, for instance, pigmentation, the kind of hair that we flaunt, or the shape of our noses, etc., etc. And in contrast to this, you know, the manner of dressing, the food, the language, interpersonal behavior, economic organization, economic and political organization. These are what I call as nurture given. These are societally given. And the fact is that over a period of time, people, groups and communities profess a sense of pride among these unique features, and yet at times these are opposed, for sometimes for right reasons, but mostly for wrong reasons. And in any case, they reflect a very complex web of pluralities, which are based on, as I said, ethnicity, religion, region, language, economic and political status, and cultural traits, in songs and stories, in myths and legends, in food habits, manners of dressing, you know, etc., etc. Or, you know, divisions like whites and blacks, Hindus and Sikhs, urban and rural, rich and poor, eligible to vote or not eligible to vote, etc., etc. There have been various attempts to deprive people of their voting rights in various manners uh, across. Comes to my mind, very early in the formation of Pakistan, Field Marshal Ayub Khan had created a category of educated graduates who alone were, eligible to vote, etc. And we, of course, know that women have been deprived the right to vote for a very long time, even in the so-called developed world, on the basis of just gender or biological differentiation. You'd be shocked to know that in a perfect, near perfect society like Switzerland, women got their right to vote much later than in a country like India, where all women got their right to vote much earlier, and so on. So what I'm trying to say is most of these traits which constitute plurality exist across nations, but there are some, of course, as you know, which are not universal in nature. Our adherence to caste, for instance, in India is not universal. It is surprising that in ancient Japanese society, similar concept of osu existed, perhaps does even now. Well, friends, human nature is very funny and finds various ways of discrimination against one another. I wish to give you two examples of how this plurality, celebrate as we must our plurality, can be taken sometimes to very ridiculous limits. I'll give you two interesting examples. Maybe many of you are already familiar. Indians arrived in South Africa through agreements as indentured labor to work for the British on the sugar plantations. These were, as is sometimes called in colloquial language, Girmitia people. Girmitia because of the agreements under which they came. But once they were numerous enough there, certain adventurous Indians, particularly of Gujarati origin, the earlier Indians indentured there were from Tamil Nadu, but many of the enterprising Indians who were already in parts of Africa, particularly Gujaratis, who were very active on the East Coast, many of them looked for greater opportunities for business and came to South Africa paying on their own their passage. And they came to be called as passenger Indians, because the earlier ones, passage was paid by the British government. These were passenger Indians. You'd be shocked to know there was no cultural, there were no cultural ties between these two kinds of Indians there. The Indians who came in indentured labor considered passenger Indians as inferiors. Let me give you another example, and this time from Canada, or it could be also true of the US in North America. That is, many Indians migrated to Canada after they had initially gone from India to Africa. That is, they became first diasporic in Africa. Later on, they became doubly diasporic, going to North America, particularly Canada. But since the 80s, particularly, a large number of Indians migrated to Canada directly from India. In fact, the initial 6 had also done so. And in Canada, these people who were doubly diasporic were at times discriminated against and considered inferior. So much for our, liking for plurality. Anyways, two interesting tendencies were visible in the human plurality mapping, both within the community and outside the community. One was, of course, that people celebrated plurality. To begin with, human groups did not discriminate between the two sexes, and that is male and female. But later, as complexities grew, we also noticed a tendency that those who were powerful, either physically powerful or societally powerful, tried to suppress this plurality. Unfortunately for them, they could not do away with this plurality. You know, it was biologically inbuilt. There were males and females to begin with. And therefore, they tried to suppress it, wish it away, at times deny it, and so on. And what happened was, those who were either at that point of time more numerous or more powerful, they have continued with this agenda of depriving the humans of their tendency to be plural. And they have tried to make their own societies, just not their own societies, but the societies around themselves, into more unity and homogeneous in character. Hemendra talked about this. And therefore, in human civilizations, hegemony came to be a reality of life, though it's very unfortunate, it is still very much with us. This, if you look at the history of human conflicts, has been at the heart of all conflicts from ancient times to modern wars, from the wars in Mahabharata and Ramayana to the Amazonian wars, or to the wars in Greece, the two world wars, or even the conflicts thereafter, even up to the latest, which could be, in Belarus or now in Ethiopia and elsewhere. These conflicts, if you look at them, have all been tendencies to make the world a monochrome. A monochrome, ethnicity-wise, religion-wise, language-wise, economic and political system-wise, and above all, culture-wise. Some of the recent tendencies, I'm sure you're all familiar with, the concept of globalization, the propagation of Pizza Huts and McDonald's, the concept of transnationals, supermarkets, Amazon, links to, eliminate small languages and cultural diversity. They have all been, or doing away with certain kinds of foods that are grown, which is very contrary to sustainability and so on. They have all been attempts to try and, push us into a unitariness. However, over a period of time, another societal truth has emerged, that those who have opposed the attempts to unitize the world have become more numerous. Those who are pro-diversity are more numerous in number, although unfortunately they do not wield power. The world, therefore, with all these aspects of plurality, which I have tried to name above, is divided now into an overreaching new binary, namely between the haves and the have-nots. The have-nots, the have-nots are supporters of plurality, and by and large, the haves are advocates of unitariness. However, hegemonic attempts have not succeeded, and I am of firm belief that they will not succeed. Thanks to the resistance which has been put up through history and which is still being put up through innumerable groups to guard this plurality. To name some of the most recent attempts, there are the LGBT groups Me Too groups, Black Lives Matter groups, human rights groups, and millions of self-help groups and NGOs working in various fields, ranging from food to fashion, water to waste management, etc., etc. They all have tried to safeguard diversity against this onslaught. The United Nations, for instance, created, and very rightly so, to unite the world, has at the same time carried this, what we have called our theme today, that is unity in plurality. United Nations and its various agencies, we know, have tried to promote diversity and have always opposed attempts to try and unify the world uh, in one single color. This is why. Because, as I said, primarily plurality and diversity are almost genetically, why almost, actually inbuilt into humans. Let me now move on to the second part, namely literary discourse. In our parts, among the Hindi speakers, we have a well-known saying, "Ma keh ek kahani," "Ma keh ek kahani," which is to signify that verbal creative discourse, also known as orature, which later on through various developments when writing was invented, became literary discourse. It is actually as old as motherhood, which is another way of saying that it is as old as humanity. Let me try and elaborate a little on this point. Why do I think so? Ancient humans, as they emerged and evolved, started observing and recording in their minds at that point of time, whatever they saw around them, the flora, the fauna, and as Hemendra also mentioned, this flora and fauna itself was so diverse and pluralistic. Thunder and lightning, darkness and moonshine, moonlight, sunshine and rains. They observed all these phenomena, and they also observed something else. They observed the interpersonal behavior between males and females, mighty and mighty.
Yes.
Sorry? Is there something?
No, sir. No, sir. It was somebody who switched on the mic. Sorry, sir, for
Okay,
the
okay,
disturbance.
okay. So they also observed various aspects of interpersonal behavior, and when they came to verbalize them, when they came to talk about them, then both nature and nurture, the observations about natural phenomenon and the observation about societal phenomenon became a part of their orature, the verbal discourse, and later on literary discourse. And interestingly, it has stayed on so since then. Therefore, when they verbalize them, each verbal presentation, each verbalization was different from the other. When they presented this to fellow human beings, when they spoke to them, or later on when they read that to them, then the listeners or the readers observed these differences, which were kind of markers of individual stamp on literary discourse. Thus, friends, was born the first verbal imaginative discourse, and later on developed into literary discourse, which interestingly, as I said earlier, by observing the things around them, the environment and the human behavior, was more factual, based on factual observations, but made distinct by individual manner of narration. Interestingly, once again, it has remained so. Fact in fiction, for instance, is as much, is as much a reality today as it was earlier. Interestingly, literary criticism was born almost at the same time as literary discourse, because when they read out these uh, discourses later or earlier, verbalized them, there were people who reacted, and people reacted in different manners. They internalized them in different manner and reacted, and that was literary criticism. Here I want to make a very interesting small diversion, if you allow me to say, about literary criticism, about the difference between the Western approach and the approach of some of the non-literary, non-European literary approaches. Call them the difference between the aesthetics. In certain societies in Africa, for instance, they have a wonderful way of evaluating cultural activities. I'll take the example of a dance. In a certain community, what happens is, not very developed community, maybe in a village, where they come together in the evening to perform a community dance. The whole community gathers in an open space and sits in a circle, when suddenly, as if on a cue, a few dancing couples emerge from within the circular audience and come to the middle of the arena and start dancing. Maybe 5 or 10 couples, they start dancing, and the others, getting the tune of the music, start clapping. And they keep dancing to the tune and to the clapping. And then suddenly people notice that the 5 have been reduced, the 10 have been reduced to 5. And the other 5, very quietly, almost unnoticed, have gone back to the audience and are now a part of the clapping audience. This goes on for a while. And then suddenly you see there are only a couple of couples left. And finally, only one is left when a great applause is given to them. This, to my mind, is very interesting example of aesthetics and cultural evaluation, that the performers and the audience are one at one point of time. At another point of time, suddenly those who are performers emerge from within the audience, and then the audience keeps on judging them, evaluating them, and those performers, realizing their comparative performance, many of them keep on going until one is chosen. This is very different from the Western aesthetics, friends, where there is now a clear sequestering between the performer and the evaluator. When someone goes to watch a performance of a play, he or she need not be familiar with the play or the traits or theatricalness of a play. He or she may be just a scholar of theater, and write a review. He or she may have never acted in a play, not even in a village side Ramlila or whatever. And similarly, those who are critics of cinema need not have produced a film, not even a small 2-minute documentary in their lives. This is how the aesthetics of discourse, cultural discourse, and evaluation works in the West. Very different from how it works elsewhere. Another thing happened to literary discourse at that point of time, and that was, in literary discourse, both the tendencies were visible because they had observed this. The tendency to support plurality and its opposition, they became an integral part of literary discourse because they were an integral part of human behavior. And this too got reflected in the narratives, one by the high and mighty and the other by weak and the powerless. And this binary continues till today. You call it with different names. You call it women's discourse and male discourse. You call it somewhere the urban and the rural discourse. You call it the Dalit and the Savarna discourse. You call it the white and the black discourse, the discourse by the hills and tribals, and the writings by the people in the plains, etc. Therefore, the binary exists today, what I may call as discourse, literary discourse by the have or have-nots. We call it by another name, friends. This plurality of discourse, now reduced to binary for just practical purposes, may also be called the class character of literary discourse. Look at any discourse in any society at any given point of time, and you will discover that at the heart of it all, this is a struggle. There is a struggle between plurality and unitariness, between hegemony and egalitarianism, between plenty and penury. And this is because literature reflects society, not in a very mechanized, linear manner, but in a very dynamic, complex manner that the society organization today is. Let me introduce here another parameter into literary discourse and its discussion, and particularly its evaluation, and that is the parameter of ethics. Literary discourse, I believe so, and I'm not the one. I am in agreement with great scholars. Literary discourse whose message, and remember, every literary discourse has a message. Art for arts is what Achebe called deodorized dog shit, and I agree with him. Every discourse has a message, is closer to the maintenance and enhancement of plurality vis-a-vis value, vis-a-vis homogenization. So the discourse which is celebrating or advocating plurality versus homogenization will have a higher appeal, will have a higher value, and will have better chances for longevity and universalization than those that try and speak of unitariness or homogenization or what you call as narrow nationalism, etc., etc. Thus, for the simple reason that the reason is that this impacts a larger part of humanity, and so has a greater appeal to them. In fact, Lenin put it very succinctly and said that larger good of the largest number is a sign of good literary discourse. And this is what I call ethics of creativity. This is what I believe is the responsibility of all writers. This is an essential part of literary discourse. To me, any discourse anywhere. In this respect, people have tried to use another word for it. Bhugiwati Ongo, who is one of the great social thinkers of our time, not just a writer, he puts it wonderfully well. He says, if this be politics, if advocating plurality vis-a-vis unitariness is politics, then every writer is a writer in politics. The only question is what and whose politics. Friends, literatures from various societies have reflected this struggle between, I'll use two other terms which are bandied about these days very, very often. Literatures from various societies have reflected this struggle between inclusion and exclusion through myriad manifestations of imagination, through stories and songs, through plays and poems. This is what I call the poetics and politics of literary discourse, in which a seesaw battle has gone on the front of, and I introduce another thing, on the front of canonization of literary discourse as well. You see, since the high and mighty powerful high, mighty, and powerful wrote a certain kind of literary discourse. And since they have power, they bludgeoned their way through the academia to make this as the norm, to make this as the canon. But as I said earlier in the beginning, they shall never pass. They shall never succeed. So also on this front of literary discourse and hegemonic canonization, look at the narratives by women, by Africans, by African Americans, by non-Europeans all over the world, by tribals and hill people, by lower castes and Dalits and slaves. They have all challenged the attempts to throttle plurality by producing societally significant pieces of discourse, and in course of time, they have become what we call as counter canon. Not
I'm
just a counter canon. Friend,
I'm
what
so
was
sorry.
considered to be periphery has become the core. There
I'm
has
sorry to
been
disturb you, sir. I just wanted to say, sir, if you can just wind up in another 2-3 minutes.
can you give me 5 minutes?
Okay.
Okay, I will wind up in 2 minutes. Let me now move to the third part, namely translation. And I want to say this, that translation is as old as literary discourse, which means it is as old as humanity, because the first translation, many people believe, occurs in the mind. When a thought is given language, when it is uttered, or when it is written, it is the first translation that takes place. And therefore, the translation of a literary discourse begins first in the head and later on becomes grounded. Translation discourse is also ethical in my opinion, because what a translator ought to do is to translate the message. That is the most important aspect of a literary discourse. And I said every text has a message. And I believe that there are various devices that a translator needs to use for translating this message. As we know, a translated text is a literary discourse is two-tone structure, linguistic and cultural, and it is in the cultural aspect that message lies. A translator ought to focus more on that, but while focusing on that, he or she has to take care of the words through which this message or pieces of socio-cultural information are given. A literary discourse is like a beehive, where honey is slotted in small pockets, and it is the job of the translator to extract that and present the whole honey life. I'll close with this statement that translation is an ethical question to my mind, because it is very significant for a translator to choose what he or she translates. This may be called the politics of translation. Who gets translated by whom and with what objective is what brings the poetics and politics of translation. To my mind, a translator ought to be very careful in choosing texts of translation that give the message of what I talked about earlier, the larger good of the largest. That is, texts which celebrate plurality, gender justice, societal equity, racial neutrality, and scores more, ought to be the ethical duty of a translator. I thank you for your patience.